I wanna take you for a ride. I wanna take you for a ride.
Marvel vs. Capcom is one of my favorite fighting games. I remember when Ultimate MVC 3 came out on the Vita and I spent endless hours playing around with it as Zero, Trish, and Jill. Just having fun and practicing while doing various things in the real world, from lunch breaks at work to waiting on laundry. But I never got to play the prior games of the series, due to them not being on handhelds and, well, not on much in general. But all of that has changed. The first Marvel vs. Capcom games have come to the Switch along with other Marvel fighting games in a recent collection. So let's take a look. Here is my review of Marvel vs. Capcom Fighting Collection Arcade Classics for the Nintendo Switch. When it comes to gameplay, this is a collection of arcade fighting games featuring Marvel characters, normally at odds with Capcom characters, be it Street Fighter or all of Capcom thrown together. With this being a collection, this is actually 7 games in one. All of these are arcade cabinet games. Obviously, Marvel vs. Capcom and Marvel vs. Capcom 2 are the focus here, bringing back the classic arcade games to handhelds for the first time ever, and back to consoles for the first time in the past 15 years. The last release having been on Xbox Live Arcade and PlayStation 3, both of which have since been removed from those storefronts, making this collection really the only way to legitimately purchase these games. Even the iOS version from 2012 was delisted from Apple's App Store less than 5 years after its initial release. Thankfully, this release includes a physical cartridge on Nintendo Switch, at least in North America and Japan, so this should be pretty much indefinitely available via that physical copy. But back to the games. Outside of Marvel vs. Capcom, we have the fighting games known as X-Men Children of the Atom, Marvel Superheroes, X-Men vs. Street Fighters, Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, and finally, to mix things up, the 2D beat-em-up game The Punisher. Most of these games are fairly basic fighting games that have decent combo systems, but not a whole lot in terms of a playable roster until you get to the Marvel vs. Capcom games. But they're all an interesting part of Marvel arcade history. How you play these games feels a bit odd when you first get started. None of the games have main menus as you would typically expect console games to, but these are arcade cabinet games and those games never had that sort of menu. Instead, you can modify settings from the game selection screen, and once you boot into the games, you're just thrown into multiplayer, training, or free play depending on whether or not you go into offline or online mode. There are some interesting things here that you can tweak. You can modify difficulty, damage, battle speed, and some even let you toggle whether or not you have secret unlockable characters initially available. This includes the full roster of Marvel vs. Capcom 2 being available, and being able to select characters like Doom, Thanos, and Anita in Marvel Superheroes without putting in the intricate cheat codes on the character select screen. It works for others as well, letting you select Akuma in X-Men Children of the Atom and Cyber Akuma, but it is worth noting that these secret characters will be immediately disabled if you try to take them into the online multiplayer. We have more arcade-centric settings here as well. Marvel vs. Capcom 2, for example, lets you swap between simple free play and a coin and credit mode, to emulate you having to put in a quarter into the cabinet and only letting you play and fail so many times. This mode is interesting as it disables normal button inputs when the game first plays until you hit R3 to quote-unquote insert 1 credit. Now you can always just keep hitting R3 over and over to add an infinite amount of credits, but it's a neat way of emulating playing this on an actual cabinet. And when we get into the actual games, I think most of us can agree that Marvel vs. Capcom 2 is the main reason we're buying this collection. Many of the other titles, like Children of the Atom or Marvel Superheroes, are neat little fighting games, and they do have a lot of skill involved with combos, but none of them as much so as the second Marvel vs. Capcom game with its more expansive moves, assist attacks, and variations to its supers. As I played each game, I had a lot of fun, and some of them did have little conveniences to help the player out. Marvel vs. Capcom 1, for example, allows you to play in easy mode that is kind of like the auto combos from Marvel vs. Capcom 3, letting you mash single attack buttons to do little combos instead of requiring you to know how to move around and the directional inputs to string those combos together. You can play any of these games in offline mode or single player against the CPU. You can also play them online, letting you battle others via the internet. The downside here is that no version of this game supports cross-platform play. That means Switch players are stuck with other Switch players, PlayStation players versus PlayStation players. While I've never failed to immediately find matches in Marvel vs. Capcom 2, it's a bit difficult to find opponents in pretty much all of the other games. When trying to test around with Marvel superheroes, I was waiting a good 10 to 15 minutes for a match, while MVC2 barely makes me wait 15 to 20 seconds. Though on the bright side, it is a fantastic couch versus game. When you go into offline mode and have a second controller connected to your Switch, player 2 can just hit start on the character select screen so you can jump in and do player versus player battles, or the 2-player co-op in the Punisher beat-em-up game. Once you get in, they play great. Since most of these games are fighting games, you pop in for a character select screen and go right into a gauntlet of battles. Each game has its own depth with combos and such, but most of it is fairly simple combinations of face buttons and directions with the D-pad or analog sticks. Marvel vs. Capcom 2 is probably the most complicated, as you can do different super attacks with different directions, and a lot of characters are very different and varied, from Dr. Doom's projectile magic attacks to Jill Valentine summoning up a rocket launcher, and many of the enemies from the original Resident Evil title, including the T-002 Tyrant. Zooming in on the Marvel vs. Capcom games, I think they've always been so flashy and fun to watch, seeing all of the different video game characters come in and fighting all of the Marvel characters. Having Cyclops, Dr. Doom, Venom, Spider-Man, and Captain America fighting against Tron Bonne, Morgan, and Jill Valentine. It's just a lot of fun to see these characters, especially the ones that don't traditionally come from fighting games. And getting back to gameplay, thankfully there isn't that much input delay when you play these games, and I found my input delay to be the same between offline and online matches, so you won't have to do a lot of adjusting to the delay when going online. The games are also just fun to play, especially in offline mode where you can tweak a bunch of things like difficulty and secret characters that we mentioned earlier. While I won't say it's as much of a blast as me jumping into Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 on my PS Vita, it's still a lot of fun in that more nostalgic fighting game way. And that brings us to content and length. These games can last you a decent amount of time depending on what you do. The Punisher beat-em-up game will likely take you about an hour or so to go through once, and a lot of other time can be used if you just like playing around in the fighting games, especially the multi-character games like Marvel vs. Capcom's 1 and 2, where you can experiment around to find a good team that you like to play as. That brings us to presentation, and these games look pretty good overall. They're not really that different than their initial incarnations. No HD smoothing, this isn't a remaster, it's just these games playing on the Switch. Though there are quite a few filter options to help smooth over some of the more jagged edge outlines to the character renders, and adding those little filters to help you, look like you're playing this on a CRTV or an old arcade cabinet screen. I was actually surprised with just how many filters there were, but whether you have this in 4:3 expanded or stretched to fill the screen, it's still gonna look good. Next up is performance. The games play fantastic and nothing is really gonna mess you up during gameplay, though I have noticed that when you're playing in handheld mode, when you get an elimination in some of these games, the frame rate will stutter and drop during that falling down animation, jumping back up once you gain control as the second character jumps in. But it is a pretty consistent issue in handheld mode. And that brings us to battery life. The Marvel vs. Capcom collection will give the original and light models a battery range of about 3.5 to 4.5 hours, while the V2 and OLED models get 6 to 7.5 hours. In conclusion, this collection brings a lot of classic Marvel arcade fighters to the handheld world, and the first console release of Marvel vs. Capcom 2 in many years. Now the downside, the lack of crossplay makes it hard to play anything outside of just Marvel vs. Capcom 2 online, but outside of that and some frame dips when you get eliminations in handheld mode, this is a great little collection of games if you enjoy Marvel or just want MVCs 1 and 2 on the go. Reviews to go rates Marvel vs. Capcom Fighting Collection Arcade Classics for the Nintendo Switch an 8.5 out of 10. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. Thank you for watching and have a great day.
I wanna